The following program is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network, available on the free YouTube channel General Grant by himself or Dr. E.C. Fields, on the Facebook page Kurt Fields as General Ulysses S. Grant, and on various other social media. The website is generalgrantbyhimself.com. This program is one of those presentations in the ongoing series General Grant Looks at the American Civil War, wherein General Grant looks at a person, place, or event in the Civil War for reflection and observation. Permission to copy and distribute is given and indeed encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. And now, the Siege and Surrender of Vicksburg, Part 2. I am Major General Ulysses S. Grant, and I am here in my tent in the field and near Vicksburg, and I should like to reflect with you about the negotiations for the surrender of Vicksburg, how they came about and what transpired. First, I should like to tell you that on June 25th, we exploded a mine under the rebel lines that left a crater big enough that I estimate you could put 2 regiments in it. Some substantial loss of life, but we did not exploit it. Then on July 1st, we blew another mine under the rebel lines, the second one, and again did some damage, some loss of life. Had some substantial, I think, moral victory for us, but little more. All the time by the 1st of July, we had been getting closer and closer to the rebel lines, trenching and satting up to them. In fact, in 10 different places, we are within 1 to 500 yards of the rebel lines. And I have ordered an all-out assault on July 6th all along the Confederate lines. By now I've got nearly 75,000 men. And the rebels, as it turned out after the surrender, had 30,000, I think 500. And of that nearly 31,000, nearly half of them were unfit for duty and ill or too weak to fight from lack of food. I knew that they would not be able to resist us, so a frontal attack along all the Confederate lines was appropriate. We had indeed widened openings in our trenches where men could go through 4 abreast. We had installed planks and stuffed bags packed tightly with cotton to throw in the trenches and lay the planks over rebel works. And we were thoroughly prepared to make the assault. Everyone was in waiting. The rebels indeed thought that we would probably make our assault on the 4th of July, which, given their point of view, was a safe and good assumption. But I was more than prepared to make that assault on July the 6th. But on July the 3rd, the motions began that resulted in the surrender. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, I was here in my tent, and white flags went up on the Confederate lines, and Major John Bowen, who had been a neighbor of mine back in St. Louis, and a Captain, I think Montgomery, who was an aide-de-camp to General Pemberton, approached our lines. He had a message, Pemberton, that, it was this: Vicksburg, Mississippi, July 3rd, 1863. Major General U.S. Grant, commanding United States Forces. General, I have the honor to propose to you an armistice for several hours with a view to arranging terms for the capitulation of Vicksburg. To this end, if agreeable to you, I will appoint 3 commissioners to meet a like number to be named by yourself to meet at such a place an hour today. I thought that noteworthy. Today, as you may find convenient. I make this proposition to save the further effusion of blood which must otherwise be shed to a frightful extent. Feeling myself fully able to maintain my position for a yet indefinite period. This communication will be handed you under flag of truce by Major General J.S. Bowen, John Bowen. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, J.C. Pemberton, Lieutenant General. Now, this message was brought to me. I declined to go out and meet with General Bowen. I did not see that to be appropriate. And he was told that I would not see him. Now, he prevailed upon my aides there that General Pemberton really wanted to meet with me to discuss the surrender. And they came back and told me, and Bowen and they went back and told Bowen I wouldn't meet with him. And then he said, how about the two generals meeting this afternoon at 3 p.m. between the lines near General McPherson's lines? And I agreed to that. I thought he's being persistent. I will meet him and see what Pemberton's got on his mind. I sent back this message with General Bowen. Lieutenant General J.C. Pemberton, commanding Confederate Forces, Vicksburg, Mississippi. General, your note of this date is just received, proposing an armistice for several hours for the purpose of arranging terms for capitulation through commissioners to be appointed, etc. The useless effusion of blood you propose stopping by this course can be ended at any time you may choose by an unconditional surrender of the city and garrison. Men who have shown so much endurance and courage as those now in Vicksburg will always challenge the respect of an adversary, and I can assure you will be treated with all the respect due to prisoners of war. I do not favor the proposition of appointing commissioners to arrange terms of capitulation because I have no terms other than those indicated above. I am, General, very respectfully, your obedient servant. Now, Bowen suggested that we meet at say 3 o'clock that afternoon, and I agreed to think the terms over and would meet with Pemberton that afternoon. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, well, before I met with Pemberton, I sent Admiral Porter this message. Vicksburg, July 3rd, 1863, Admiral Porter. I have given the rebels a few hours to consider the proposition of surrendering, all to be pardoned here, the officers to take only sidearms. My feelings are against this, but all my officers think the advantage gained by having our forces and transports for immediate purposes more than counterbalance the effect of sending them north. And I asked him to cease firing on his shelling of the city until further notice from me. Well, I went out to meet General Pemberton at 3 o'clock. I had 7 officers with me. Pemberton brought 2, General Bowen and aide-de-camp Captain Montgomery with him. And Pemberton and I approached each other, and Pemberton said, well, what are your terms for surrender? And I said, unconditional surrender. And he said, well, we might as well not talk then. And I said, as you will. And turned to Pemberton was mounting his horse, and I walked toward mine. Bowen almost leaped forward and said, wait just a moment. Why don't you two go sit in the shade of that tree on that log over there and let us work with your aides, Seth Williams and A.J. Smith and Bowen and Montgomery, and we'll see if we can't work out some kind of satisfactory terms. I was more than comfortable with that. I knew Pemberton from the Mexican War. I'd been in the 4th Infantry. He was in the 4th Artillery, and we knew each other pretty well. And I actually looked forward to visiting with John Pemberton for a bit. And I also knew I was not held by any agreement that those aides might arrive at. So let them talk. They talked for a while. We chatted, and Bowen proposed that we let them leave with their artillery and their arms and march out with all their equipage. And I said, that's not satisfactory. I cannot have that, will not have that. And Pemberton was going to leave in a huff. Bowen, again, the diplomat, said, well, give it some thought, General. We will give it some thought, but please consider the matter this afternoon and give us a response then, rather than here in the moment, in the heat of the moment, I think he was implying. And I said, all right, I will respond to you by 10 o'clock this evening. So it was getting to be 10 p.m. on the 3rd of July. Now, this is what I sent, and I went back to my staff and had really the only council of war I ever had, and I'll never do it again. But I called in all of my division and corps commanders who were on the line facing Vicksburg. Remember, I've got about half my army with their backs to the rest of the army facing Joe Johnston to the north and northeast of us. And I told them what the situation was and about the possibility of parole rather than unconditional surrender. Porter had advised me that to take all of those men in Pemberton's army up north to Aiken's Bend on the James River in Virginia would take possibly months. And I'd have to feed those soldiers as we're waiting to transport all of them. Under the Dix-Hill Agreement, General John Dix, General D.H. Hill of the Confederates, John Hill, or rather John Dix of the Federals, had worked out the exchange agreements. And they said that there were 2 places where prisoners could be exchanged. Confederate prisoners at Aiken's Landing on the James River in Virginia, and Federal prisoners at Vicksburg. And there was Nathan Watts, who was an appointed exchange commissioner, who was in Vicksburg at that time. And I thought, agreed with the logic, why take all of that time to send 31,000 men north to Aiken's Landing in Virginia, only to have them paroled because they didn't have an equal number of federal prisoners to exchange. So they would be paroled from Aiken's Landing. That did not make sense. We had an exchange agent here. The Confederates could surrender here, be paroled. Most of Pemberton's men were from the Southwest, or many of them were, and I felt that they'd go home and not fight any longer, and I would not be held on garrison duty. So I had the 2 good potential results in that I thought most of his men would go home once Pemberton had them paroled, and it would save me the time of waiting to ship all of them north. It made sense, but it grated on me. I wanted the unconditional surrender, and Pemberton was demanding. But he went back and had a council of war, so to speak. He asked his 4 leading commanding generals, should they surrender? 2 of them said, yes, surrender. 2 of them said, well, don't surrender, but they, in essence, really did say surrender. So Pemberton had a clear path to surrender and try to get the best deal that he could. But I sent, at about 10 o'clock that night, I sent this message to Pemberton. General, in conformity with agreement of this afternoon, I will submit the following proposition for surrender of the city of Vicksburg, public stores, etc. On your accepting the terms proposed, I will march in 1 division as a guard and take possession at 8 a.m. tomorrow. As soon as rolls can be made out and paroles signed by officers and men, you will be allowed to march out of our lines, the officers taking with them their sidearms and clothing, and the field, staff, and cavalry officers one horse each. The rank and file will be allowed all their clothing but no other property. If these conditions are accepted, any amount of rations you may deem necessary can be taken from the stores you now have. He had told me they had at least 2 weeks' rations left. So that's why I said, take your food from your own stores. As it turned out, they only had about 4 days of rations left. And also have the necessary cooking utensils for preparing them. Bring your own pots and pans. We're not going to provide them. 30 wagons also, counting two-horse or mule teams as one, will be allowed to transport such articles as cannot be carried along. The same conditions will be allowed to all sick and wounded officers and soldiers as fast as they become able to travel. The paroles for these latter must be signed, however, while officers are present authorized to sign the roll of prisoners, so they couldn't leave immediately. They had to wait. All of them had to leave at one time. I am, General, very respectfully, your obedient servant, U.S. Grant. Pemberton did not like that so well, and he thought about it and responded late into the evening. General, I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your communication of this date proposing terms of capitulation for this garrison and post. In the main, your terms are accepted, but in justice both to the honor and spirit of my troops, manifested in the defense of Vicksburg, I have to submit the following amendments, which, if acceded to by you, will perfect the agreement between us. At 10 a.m. tomorrow, I propose to evacuate the works in and around Vicksburg and to surrender the city and the garrison under my command. By marching out with my colors and arms, stacking them in front of their present lines, after which you will take possession. Officers to retain their sidearms and personal property, that will become key, and the rights and property of citizens to be respected. I am, General, very respectfully, J.C. Pemberton. I mused about this, and I had my war council, so to speak, every one of my officers advocating the parole and not unconditional surrender, which grated upon me. I thought I'll never have another war council, because if you don't do what they suggest, then you only make them angry and damage morale. But I went along with the parole, although I wanted unconditional surrender. My reply, getting into now early hours of the 4th of July, 63, was to General Pemberton. General, I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your communication of July 3rd. The amendment proposed by you cannot be acceded to in full. It will be necessary to furnish every officer and man with a parole signed by himself, which, with the completion of the rolls of prisoners, will necessarily take some time. Excuse me. Again, I can make no stipulations with regard to the treatment of citizens and their private property. While I do not propose to cause them any undue annoyance or loss, I cannot consent to leave myself under any restraint by stipulations. The property which officers will be allowed to take with them will be as stated in my proposition of last evening. That is, officers will be allowed their private baggage and sidearms, and mounted officers one horse each. If you mean by your proposition for each brigade to march to the front of the lines now occupied by it, and stack arms at 10 a.m. and then return to the inside and there remain as prisoners until properly paroled, I will make no objection to it. Should no notification be received of your acceptance of my terms by 9 a.m., I shall regard them as having been rejected and shall act accordingly. Should these terms be accepted, white flags should be displayed along your lines to prevent such of my troops as may not have been notified from or about not firing upon your men. I am General, very respectfully, etc., U.S. Grant. The private baggage issue, there was some rumoring and rumbling about Confederate officers taking their slaves with them, and I was not about to have any of that. That's why I again stipulated private baggage and sidearms, and I got away from the property term. And mounted officers, one horse each. Early on the morning of July the 4th, General Pemberton replied to me, General, I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your communication of this day, and in reply to say that the terms proposed by you are accepted. J.C. Pemberton, Lieutenant General. Well, we marched in, as I said, one brigade at 8 a.m. The Confederates stacked their arms with their bands playing and their colors flying, stacked arms and colors, and then turned and marched back into their former lines and became prisoners of war. And Vicksburg was ours. I went into town at about noon to congratulate and to thank Admiral Porter for his hearty support of our efforts in the Vicksburg campaign. And then I returned to my camp and remained there until actually July the 6th, before I went back into the town. I did telegraph my superior officer, General Henry Wager Halleck, at about 10:30 a.m. that morning, and I said, the enemy surrendered this morning. The only terms allowed is their parole as prisoners of war. This I regarded as of great advantage to us at this juncture. It saves probably several days in the capture term, leaves troops and transports ready for immediate service. General Sherman, with a large force, will face immediately on Johnston and drive him from the state. I will send troops to the relief of General Banks and return the Ninth Corps to General Burnside, U.S. Grant. I put that on a riverboat going north. It had to go to Cairo, Illinois to get to the first telegraph that was secure to get the message to General Halleck, and as I understand, he got it on July the 7th. And Vicksburg was ours. The 47-day siege was over. We fronted Johnston and advanced on him and drove him away. And the river was open to Port Hudson, a number of miles south downriver from Vicksburg. But actually, one of my classmates with whom I graduated, Frank Gardner, had gone south and was in command of Port Hudson and had resisted everything Nathaniel Banks had thrown at him for weeks. But when I sent Banks information that Vicksburg had surrendered, he had copies of the letter made, and one of them got into the inside of Fort Hudson, and Gardner saw it on the 8th and sent word to Banks that if that was the case, he was going to surrender, no need to maintain holding out. Banks assured him that it was the truth, and Frank Gardner, one of my class of 1843 classmates whom I knew well, surrendered to Nathaniel Banks, Port Hudson, on the 9th of July. And as of the 9th of July, the Mississippi River from source to mouth, as President Lincoln said, did flow unvexed to the sea. The siege and surrender of Vicksburg had been consummated. For the moment, I have said quite enough, and I must be about my business. But I hope that you see fit to join me in part 3 of the siege and surrender of Vicksburg, when I reflect with you about what happened after Vicksburg was surrendered. And for the moment, I bid you an affectionate farewell.